Welcome everyone to the April meeting of the Delta Independent Science Board. I'm Lisa Wanger and we're gonna get going. So first, an overview of our public comment process. We will take written questions and comments, and you should follow the instructions on your screen that will be either up there, there they are. And the instructions are also in the meeting notice. And now I'd like to do the roll call. Steve Brandt is not available today. Virginia is joining us in a minute. Tanya.
Tanya Heikola, no new declarations.
Virginia
Holster, no new declarations.
There you are, Virginia. Go ahead.
Virginia Dale, no new declarations.
Anna.
Anna McCulloch, no new declarations.
Diane. Bob.
Bob Nyman, no new declarations.
Obey.
Jayant Abhishekar, I do have one issue. I have an IPA from U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to work on sea level rise projections for some European countries. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Obey. Lisa Wanger, I have no new declarations. And Inga.
She said no. Inga Werner, no new declarations.
Thanks, Inga. Okay, I'm just gonna give an overview, quick overview of the agenda. So we're kicking off our decision-making under deep uncertainty seminar series today with Alice Hill, and that will be in an interview style. Then we're going to have a discussion of the decision-making under deep uncertainty prospectus, and then a Delta lead scientist reappointment discussion that will be in closed session. At this point, are there any public comments?
There are none.
All right, well then we're just going to kick things right off. We have a short introduction to the concepts of decision-making under deep uncertainty. And as soon as I can share my screen, we'll get going on that. A Delta ISB panelist may wish to turn their cameras off at this time so we can focus on the presentations. Okay, are those slides looking correct? Great. Okay, so the ISB has undertaken this new initiative to look at decision-making under deep uncertainty. And this introduction today is just going to briefly describe what it is and why we think it might be useful. So I'm Lisa Wanger, the chair of the Delta Independent Science Board, and I'm joined by Delta lead scientist Laura Larson. And let's jump right in. So first of all, what do we mean by this term deep uncertainty? In a word, it just means unpredictability. We don't really understand the likelihood of certain future events, and outcomes can't be well characterized with existing data and models. And this uncertainty can't be easily reduced just by going out and collecting more data. And importantly, stakeholders may not agree on the consequences of actions. So this is an opportunity to explore these types of uncertainties. And I don't think we have to stretch our brains too far to think of some deep uncertainty experiences we've had lately in California. Okay, so that's what the concept of deep uncertainty is. But what is decision-making under deep uncertainty? It's a decision support system to evaluate these unpredictable and often ignored future events. And it isn't one thing, it's really an umbrella term for a variety of tools that can be used in both small ways and very comprehensive, more time-consuming ways. And our effort is going to focus a lot on scenario development, which is one of the key ways you can explore unpredictable events. And these things can be informed by careful data analysis of past events and modifying them to represent changing conditions, as well as looking to the horizon for things that may indicate changing conditions. Even if we're uncertain, we might want to bring that into our scenarios. There's a big element of exploratory modeling. And one way that gets used is to stress test management solutions. So we might have our best guess idea of what the future is going to look like, and we've created a management solution for that best guess. But we may want to explore how frequently that approach leads to regret when the future varies from what our prediction is. So that's that's the stress testing idea, just to understand how robust a solution is to uncertainty. And then that leads you to identify vulnerabilities, tipping points where the optimal solution fails, and things you might want to monitor and keep an eye on. And then finally, there's a big element of adaptive planning, of thinking, you know, at what point do I need to change my behavior as I see changing conditions? And all of this is underpinned by strong stakeholder engagement and deliberative approaches to overcome these different perspectives on what might be happening in the future. So I like this slide for really explaining what the scenario goals are. So these cones represent projections in time. So we have historic evidence and we understand a range of variability associated with historic evidence. And we're trying to project into the future to look at what the variability could be. And so the green cone here is what we tend to focus on, which is the more probable futures, maybe the central tendencies, if you will. But each dot represents a scenario in this cone. And, you know, it may be worthwhile to think about how to push the system into a more preferred solution, or just wildcard events that may change how we want to plan for the future. And so the idea of this type of scenario planning is to go beyond the probable to the possible and the plausible and the possible. And now I'm going to turn it over to Laurel to give us some more examples.
Thanks, Lisa. So I put together a few slides just to make decision-making under deep uncertainty a little more concrete and show that to some extent, it's already being done in California, although we do have a long way to go. So one of the examples of DMDU that is probably familiar to a large swath of Californians is the arc storm scenario development process. It was a process of working with a team of 117 different scientists, engineers, policy experts, and employees of first response institutions to figure out a strategy for responding to a sequence of severe winter storms, similar to the storm that happened in 1861 and 1862 that left the Central Valley of California impassable. So basically, this scenario was based on a scientific convergence of temperature and precipitation, very similar to that event, followed by an examination of secondary hazards like landslides and flooding, physical damages to the built environment, and social and economic consequences. As a result of coming together and figuring out how they would deal with such a scenario as it unfolded, one of the things that I've heard is that agencies felt much more prepared to deal with situations like we experienced in this recent wet season. Next, Edmund. So ArcStorm is now in its second phase of development. A team is putting together a historical and a warmer future scenario that, unlike the previous ArcStorm that took place in 2010, are rigorously quantitative. So these scenarios were taken as the top 3 30-day precipitation accumulations in current and warmer climate across a swath of GCMs. And as I said, this scenario development process is underway, and we should see more information soon. Next slide. So Lisa had a really nice summary of some of the different approaches or tools that are used within decision-making under deep uncertainty, and these can be integrated in a strategy like a robust decision-making strategy. This is actually a figure that we'll hear about a little bit later in our seminar series. But one way to start by looking at this figure is to start with the decision framing step, which is basically developing the scope of an analysis through structured engagements with stakeholders. Developing the scope consists of looking at measures of performance, actions that can be taken by policymakers, what are the key uncertain factors, and then what are the mathematical relationships or even qualitative relationships among the different factors. And then from there, one would evaluate strategies across futures, and this could be done through a simulation approach, like a real-time simulation approach that engages agencies. It could be done in the modeling space. But it's basically a way to evaluate how those decisions play out under future conditions, where each future reflects one set of assumptions across uncertainties. And then Lisa mentioned the vulnerability analysis, which is basically using statistical tools to identify those future uncertain conditions that would lead strategies to perform poorly. And the decision relevant scenarios are pulled out of that analysis as concise descriptions of those futures in which the strategies do perform poorly, and that will likely need a different strategy to achieve acceptable performance. And so then, as you can see, this is an iterative process. One would re-engage stakeholders to define what those new futures and strategies should be based on both the vulnerability analysis and a trade-off analysis. New futures would basically be defined to expand the range of uncertainties or to focus on more specific combinations of uncertainties that are relevant to the choice of strategy in order to identify a set of robust strategies. Next. And this is an approach that's actually been taken to evaluate a number of different trade-offs for different climate futures in the Sacramento San Joaquin Valley. And I won't say much of it now. I won't say much about this now because you'll hear more later in the seminar series. Edmund, go ahead and skip to the next slide altogether, please. Thanks. And so that brings me to a preview of what we'll see throughout the year as we undertake this seminar series. We will be exploring different aspects of decision-making under deep uncertainty, including topics such as flood risk, horizon scanning and how we do it, how we better communicate risk, dynamic adaptive management planning, mitigating cognitive biases, and incorporating human behavior into scenarios. I just want to flag for your attention that our next seminar is scheduled for June 14th at 1 p.m., in which we'll be looking at some of these tools that I spoke about and their applications in California. And that seminar will feature Robert Lempert at the RAND Corporation and Andrew Schwartz at the California Department of Water Resources. Next.
Thanks, Laurel. So yeah, we do acknowledge that some of this is already going on. And so we hope that we can bring attention to some of these efforts and share tools. So we see a variety of benefits of applying decision-making under deep uncertainty. And I'm not probably going to walk through all this slide in the interest of time, but let me just say that, you know, I think we've had some recent examples where we could have used some more enhanced perception of changing conditions, such as the fact that the runoff yield from the snowpack changed dramatically after the extended drought in ways that weren't incorporated in the models. And that created some management challenges. So that's the kind of issue that we see that might be overcome by new types of anticipating future change. And I think there's a variety of benefits. And you'll hopefully by the end of the seminar series, you're going to agree that this provides a nice structure for anticipating and managing uncertainty and associated risks, and being better prepared for the future. So with that, I am going to introduce our speaker for today. Oh, public comments? Turn off sharing. I get a lot of help here, and I appreciate it. Okay, we are thrilled to have Alice Hull joining us today to discuss what she's learned from her experience using concepts from decision-making under deep uncertainty to build resilience to climate change. She is currently the David Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations, and she served as a special assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council, where she led the development of a national policy to build resilience to catastrophic risks, including climate change and biological threats. That work included leading the Department of Homeland Security's effort to develop its first ever climate adaptation plan. So she's really been in the trenches making this practical, and some of the lessons that she learned from that are in a book she co-authored, Building a Resilient Tomorrow, How to Prepare for the Coming Climate Disruption. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laurel, and she's going to start us off.
Well, Alice, welcome. We're really excited to have you chat with us today. And we thought we'd kick off this discussion by just inviting you to tell us a little bit more about how you got involved in climate adaptation planning which led to the illustrious career that Lisa just highlighted.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Laurel and Lisa, for having me here today. It's really my honor and pleasure. The work that you're doing is so important for not only California, but really the United States. So my hat is off to you and the team for taking on the important issues surrounding the Delta. So I didn't start my career in climate. I started my career in law, actually in California. I was chief of the major frauds unit, which is the white collar crime unit at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles. I was chasing bad guys, mostly it was guys with briefcases who were stealing from banks and others. And then I went on to the Los Angeles Municipal and Superior Courts until I got a telephone call. And my career advice for those who wonder, how do you go from being a state of California judge to a policymaker in the federal government? Be nice to those you sit next to in law school. I sat next to Janet Napolitano, who was at that time the governor of Arizona. She called me when she was invited by President Obama to become the secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. And she said, do you want to join me in Washington? So eventually I said yes. My family and I all switched our jobs and our schools to move to Washington, D.C. I started with her as her senior counselor, and really in the very early days of my being at the Department of Homeland Security, which is the third largest agency in the federal government. And I should step back here. It's right behind the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's smaller than the Department of Defense, but it's larger than all the other agencies. It's this huge sprawling security agency that was born out of the events of 9/11. It's got Customs and Border Protection, our immigration services. It has FEMA, our emergency management services, TSA, the Secret Service, Coast Guard. So a whole range of different mission sets. And it was a shotgun wedding after 9/11, which forced all these agencies to work together. So when I arrived at that department in 2009, President Obama signed an executive order that required all agencies to engage in both cutting their emissions, but for the first time ever in adaptation planning. And unfortunately, in Washington, at that time, working on climate change was not viewed as a career enhancer. It was a bit viewed as a politically toxic football. I mean, that still occurs here in Washington. But I was the new person. So essentially it was, oh, give it to her. She's new. And I was tasked with figuring out what this very large security agency should do about planning for climate change. And in 2009, the task force I assembled from the agency, I would say it's fair to say there was a high degree of skepticism about why they should be even working on climate change when there were so many other issues that were front and center. And so as we embarked on our work, this was probably a little bit insubordinate to the president, but we asked ourselves, the first question is, does DHS even need to care about climate adaptation in 2009? And as we heard from climate scientists across the federal government, and we had access to scientists from NASA, NOAA, USDA, you name it, the conclusion for all of us was DHS should care deeply. I would call it an aha moment when we realized how climate impacts, flooding, extreme heat, drought, sea level rise, you name it, affects everything that the department does. And so we wrote this first climate adaptation plan. And then as a result of that, eventually, when Janet Napolitano left to run the University of California system, I was invited to join the White House, where eventually I did oversee the Resilience Directorate in the National Security Council, where I worked directly on adaptation policy, as well as other policies, but adaptation policies for climate change for the federal government. Some of the very first policies that were issued, some of those policies were revoked by President Trump, and then President Biden on his very first day brought them back. So that's how I got started in adaptation work. And then since leaving the Obama administration, I've been at think tanks where I continue to focus on ways that we can do better in understanding the risks that are already here, and importantly, those that are destined, and better prepare our infrastructure, our systems to withstand those impacts, and really that we can thrive in a warming world. It remains a challenge. I think our adaptation efforts here in the United States are not where they need to be in order to protect all of us from the changing world.
Yeah, well, thank you for that answer. It's a really impressive trajectory. And one of the things that resonated with me was your mention of the volatility at the federal level in working on climate change issues. We've seen that play out with Trump rescinding policies, Biden reinstating them. You mentioned that when you first joined the federal government, it wasn't seen as a career advancer to be working on these issues. So I guess my next question is really focused on, what do you see as the role of state government in planning for climate change under increasing uncertainty about the future? And does a state like California, which is known for fairly consistently progressive politics, does a state like California have the opportunity to provide leadership here, and how?
Absolutely. California already provides significant leadership, and I anticipate it will continue to do so. We do see New York is also another example of a state providing leadership. And then, unfortunately, the leadership typically falls in whether it's a primarily democratically run or Democratic Party run state or Republican state. As to the level of climate planning, it's not that the red states don't have resilience planning, but they might not have the planning that calls for considering climate risks, which is what we're talking about here. And that is, in my opinion, absolutely essential for any kind of resilience plan, because if you don't look at future risks, but only look in the rearview mirror looking at your past risks, you will be deeply unprepared. So to answer your question, state governments are very, very important in showcasing best practices for innovation and protecting their own populations and therefore their economies going forward. So with California, I remember a very early example, and frankly, the federal government has not been able to truly match it. CalAdapts. It was this, interactive GIS. You could just go down and look at a particular area and get a sense of what's ahead for that area. I remember looking at that, maybe when I was at DHS, but certainly when I was at the White House, and just saying, we got to get to that for the United States. And it still remains a challenge for us to have that kind of granularity for people to understand what's ahead and engage in these discussions. And then, of course, when you look at the housing, some of the density issues and that's usually framed as affordability of housing. But when you're talking about climate change, we also need to increase density to get people into safer areas, as we're learning that some areas are destined to burn or to flood. So states, as we see the flip-flop on the national level, can continue to drive resilience. I think that states can't do it alone. And the Delta work has shown this, not so much, it's just shown that we need to have regional planning. And sometimes that planning is going to cross state lines. And unless you have some other entities that can assist with that, the federal government could assist with that in ways of providing money for regional planning and providing incentives. That could drive further action than just leaving it up to the states alone to solve these problems where they have a shared water source, for example, or one state's wildfire risk becomes another state's wildfire risk.
That's great. Thanks. Really helpful answer. One of the arguments against doing this decision making or planning for improbable circumstances is the high cost of managing for extreme risks. When is it a net benefit for governments to plan for these low probability but high impact events? How should governments weigh that cost benefit of planning for these extreme scenarios? Because obviously it takes a lot of resources to do so, and we can't plan for every extreme or every type of extreme.
Absolutely. We're never going to capture all the events that will occur. And it was Eisenhower who, of course, led troops in World War II, who said, planning is essential, but plans are useless. So just the fact of planning, we heard earlier, the fact of planning for a scenario that resembled what happened in the 1860s in California can help build relationships, increase awareness, drive greater preparedness. So planning is a good idea. I do say that with climate change, I think that it's no longer a high risk, low frequency event. It is, I mean, these events are occurring rapidly. The scientists I speak to generally say that what has surprised them is not that these things have unfolded just as predicted, but they have unfolded more quickly. So to treat this as a, I guess now the new term is gray rhino, but to treat this as these as black swans, I just don't think is appropriate anymore. This poses a major challenge for policymakers, scientists, you name it, because we're really confronting, if you step back from it, a problem that no one in recorded history has confronted at this scale. And the problem does not require, unlike, say, nuclear or cyber, which are catastrophic threats, it doesn't require any human intervention. There's, no human is what we call human intelligence to see what's going to happen, whether what the nuclear arsenal is for a different country. This is just happening on its own because of the burning of fossil fuels, but it will occur. And some of the events are very certain to occur. Some of them are such as sea level rise and heat. So not to plan for them seems to me that we are just ignoring the white swans now out there. It's very difficult because humans, the cognition issues, which has also been referenced in the introduction, are huge for humans to be able to assess this risk. We are just not accustomed to assessing a risk that's unfamiliar to us. And I think that has held us back in our planning for climate change and a number of other cognitive biases. So I say we should put aside the thought that these are uncertain risks. We don't know exactly how they'll unfold, but we do know that they're ahead. So we should be planning for a whole range of risks because we know that they will compound. They don't have to be as big, but we could have multiple of them, which could cause even more damage than just one big event. So we need to start forcing our imaginations so that we can work on creating the plans, which we may not execute in their fullness, but at least we'll have started the process to be better prepared.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
I was gonna pass it to Lisa to ask the next question, but I really like that term, planning for the gray rhinos.
I might have to get you to explain that term. I'm not sure I know what you mean by that, but I don't want to start there though. I appreciate that you brought up the arc storm and you mentioned the relationship building, because I do think people may have this misconception that by looking at these extreme events, we're now going to build infrastructure to protect for those extreme events. And that may not be feasible. That may not be the right solution. But in the meantime, I think what you're saying is we still are better prepared in other ways, either through relationships or other insights we get. Have you seen, first, so feel free to bring up gray rhinos and define that a little bit more, but in answer to this question, which is, what tools have you really seen be successful at getting people to make progress? Is it the decision-making under deep uncertainty, is that the useful tool? Are there elements within that that you found most useful?
Well, I think that work is just excellent. I happen to have known Rob Lempert. He married a childhood friend of mine, so I've known him for years. And I think his work at RAND is phenomenal. So he latched on to this challenge very early on. And I know that it's been used in, his work has been used, for example, on the Colorado River, really across the globe. So I applaud it. And I think you've got to choose, if any group has to choose a framework for deciding, okay, what are we, first of all, what does it look like ahead? And then what are we going to do about what we see is coming ahead? So I think RAND's work has worked successfully in a number of areas. Another area that I have more direct involvement was when I was in the White House. Some of our international aid agencies requested help. They said, look, we are handing out a lot of money to countries, and we don't have any idea whether that money, the investments we're making, will withstand the future impacts of climate change. So I was given the assignment of, again, assembling a task force to decide what we should do. And eventually President Obama issued an executive order that was looking at international development aid and climate risk. And through that work, we determined that in the first instance, any decision regarding a major investment should be screened itself for climate risk. So let's say you're going to build a road somewhere. You need to look, is the road going to be subject to flooding? Is it going to be subject to extreme heat where the asphalt will buckle? And any variety of things, sea level rise. And then you should make sure that you account for those going forward. And I will say that just this week, I ran into somebody who was at USAID, and that executive order was not pulled by Trump, and USAID took that executive order and they have implemented that approach throughout all their programming. So they are confident that when they're making an investment overseas, that investment will withstand the impacts. Now, there's an important question that should actually be the follow-on, and we did not get to that in our work. It's, should you build the road in the first place? And that is a critical issue, I think, for state governments when they're investing in infrastructure. And it's highly politicized, but we need to prioritize the investments we're making. And it doesn't make sense, might not make sense, and we see this on the East Coast, huge investments in bridges to barrier islands. Well, those barrier islands may be wiped out. So what's our expected service life for that bridge? What's the expected usage for that barrier island as we see rapid sea level rise and coastal erosion? But we aren't to the point in the United States where we're having those discussions yet. In my opinion, if we had a national adaptation plan and the opinion of the Government Accounting Office, which is essentially the watchdog for the federal government, if we had such a plan, and that would help us get to those difficult decisions. And a gray rhino is just a play on the white swan, black swan, whatever. It's just that this is now much more obvious, but it's essentially the elephant in the room, but we're not discussing it because I think our cognitive biases, people don't know what to do, and it's been such a highly politicized topic. But for going forward, to not consider climate risk for any investment or decision about land use, building, in my opinion, I'm a former judge, at some point it will cross into the area of negligence, because you need to consider what will happen over the service life of any infrastructure you're investing in, or any decision that you're taking that involves investments.
Well, I appreciate that answer and your leadership in helping us be more proactive in thinking about these risks. I think you're.
Oh, I should, excuse me, I should have added. So what we did in that international development is we went to the World Bank. We don't have to create all of these tools ourselves. The World Bank was going through the same thing. They had a screening tool. They said, sure, you can borrow the screening tool. So the USAID took the screening tool to, to check all the different impacts, to make it easy for officers to not have to be experts in climate change, but be able to work through what the risks were. And we borrowed from them and then went on. So it's a matter of kind of piecing these things together in a way that's useful for those who aren't climate experts to help support their decisions.
That's a helpful addition. I appreciate that. So if you weren't asking the question, should we build the road, how did that risk information inform the investments?
Well, it just helped them make sure that whatever they did, they weren't going to be putting more money in an area that would be likely flooded in the near future, or in the floodplain. They would move it off. As I say, it has not resulted in it may have resulted, I don't have the answer, in our international development work, because it's a little easier politically for us to say, no, we don't want to build something, than it is for us to say, no, we don't want to build something in the United States. Take my Barrier Island example, those islands and the elected officials there are highly dependent on tourism dollars to sustain their communities. So to cut them off with no bridge means that community will atrophy and suffer severe economic consequences. So what we have, the system we have right now in the United States, the former head of the Army Corps of Engineers described it to me as essentially, it's like we spread a very thin layer of peanut butter in all of our investments, but we don't really make the choices about which investments are of the most value to protecting the most people, or whatever metric we use. We haven't gotten there yet.
So in your ideal world, how would we use these economic factors to prioritize these investments?
Well, I think it's economic factors, but I think there's also equity factors. And certainly FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, has been criticized for solely looking at economic factors such as the value of property, because if you only look at the value of property, because of historical discrimination and other factors, you're going to find that white communities own more highly valued property than Black and Hispanic, Latino communities, Asian communities. And so we need to come up with different metrics, and FEMA has begun to work on that. So it can't be solely economic metrics to do that. But in any of this, it's a question, I think, of emphasizing the gains that come from greater investments in risk reduction measures. We don't have a really sound economic modeling on this, and our cost benefit analysis is not as strong as it should be, in my opinion. But through FEMA and the National the Institute of Building Sciences, we've come up with a metric that measures the value of certain federal programs in reducing risk. And we found that, for example, if you have stronger building codes, for every dollar you spend, you save $11 in disaster recovery costs. Over all the programs, it's about $4 to $6 for every dollar invested. So if you look at the choices that you're making now to factor in that as a rough estimate, if you're looking at future risk and reducing future risk, you'll have a big payoff, is very important, and to keep that in mind. It's a real challenge. I'm not going to downplay it. We don't have the building codes, the model building codes yet that account for climate risk. We really don't have the, we have infrastructure guidelines. We don't have infrastructure standards. This is all the planes being built as we fly or are flying it. And of course, then we have an overlay of political noise that makes it difficult sometimes for some groups to make progress on these issues. And so that's why I said earlier, we are really remarkably unprepared in the United States for what's ahead, given our wealth. Over, I think it's about half of the states in the United States do not have a disaster resilience code, and that's just resilience to the types of events we've experienced in the past. It's not to future climate events. And some of those states are in our Gulf states, which are, of course, heavily influenced by sea level rise, heat, and bigger storms.
Thanks, Alice. And Lisa, if you might, I was just texted a question actually by Michael George, the former Delta Watermaster. And it's a question that pertains to the context of investment. And he says, it seems like insurance availability needs to be aligned with climate risk beyond public investment in infrastructure. How do we do that?
Well, I do chair for the California Department of Insurance, a working group focused on climate change and insurance. As far as we know, we're the only group that's out there within the 50 states, and we issued a number of recommendations, which California has already, some of them California has already acted on. But honestly, availability of property insurance is going to be a challenge going forward with climate change. You've already experienced that in California with wildfires. What you will see is that because insurance companies only write insurance policies on an annualized basis, that you get your contract once a year. If there's a really bad year, they can move away and just stop writing. They can leave the state. Of course, California is a huge, what is it, the 6th largest economy in the world, the 4th largest insurance market. So insurance companies aren't going to walk away lightly, but it is a problem that it will not be available. And what you've seen in your California is your FAIR plan, the number of people who are going to that backup plan for people that is sponsored by the government that can't get private insurance, or that plan is growing. And honestly, in California, there is a challenge with using the models. Right now, California requires insurers who, if they're deciding whether to write a policy or how to price their policies, they can't use forward-looking models. They have to look at the loss in the past 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so when you had the big fire season in 2017, I think the insurance industry lost about 22 years worth of profits in that single year. So you've already got in Florida, Texas, Louisiana insurance commissioners warning that a crisis is occurring as insurance prices go up in response to the growing risk. And of course, behind the insurance companies are reinsurers. Those are these big international companies that spread risk across the globe. And one of the heads of those, maybe 6 years ago or so, said if we have a 3-degree Celsius world, it's uninsurable. And then most recently, just last month, the head of the largest insurance brokerage in the United States testified before Congress that climate change was destabilizing the property insurance market. So the solutions, we have recommendations, but it's going to be a major challenge because Prices, if you charge actuarially sound, that means prices that reflect the true risk. Prices for insurance are going to go up. And when it comes to wildfire, an individual homeowner can't necessarily significantly mitigate their own risk to justify a major reduction in their premium, because some of the risk is community-based. It's like if your neighbor has a whole bunch of dead wood around their property and a wood shake roof and a lot of other things, the flames may just catch your property, even though you've removed all the vegetation, you have a fireproof roof, and you've taken other measures. We just don't know enough about the dynamics of wildfire to be able to stop it at the line of a neighbor's property.
Thanks, Alice. And just to set the record straight, the question actually came from Jay Ziegler, the current Delta Water Master, who has apparently inherited Michael George's phone. And I just need to update my contact list. That answer, though, and some of your previous answers really underscored the role of economic modeling in decision-making under deep uncertainty, particularly economic modeling that is linked to some of these climate change forecasts. So I think that really illustrates a potential role for scientists in this field of decision-making under deep uncertainty. But a question for you is how can scientists actually facilitate the adoption of these practices by the government? And is there a role that's currently untapped or poorly explored?
Well, I think scientists, and it may not be a comfortable role for them, but to be communicators on this and communicate it in a way, not for your peers in the scientific community, but for the average person to understand it. And I think that can be a challenge for a variety of reasons, particularly academic scientists who are making their way towards tenure and have to be concerned about how they're viewed among their peers and not stepping out and talking about fields for which they are not the known expert. But when you talk about what role they could play, you could pick any area as a scientist with knowledge, in my opinion, and be helpful. You could pick land use, you could pick building codes, you could figure out how to make data usable. I've talked about communication of risk. We are just at the beginning of this journey, and we simply don't have enough applied science to help communities make the decisions that they need to make. And that comes down to, it could be figuring out how do you downscale the modeling to make it relevant for the decision levels that are involved. It could be exploring ways to share data in a manner that people can more readily understand. We still need the research. We need the climate research. I'm not suggesting, but I think we have a lack of applied science in this field. And it could be co-production of science. It can be a variety of ways. But we're beginning to see universities step in and taking a much more interdisciplinary approach with this. And it is an interdisciplinary problem. And I think that adds to the challenge, because people make their careers within one discipline, but this problem requires you to look across disciplines and work with people across disciplines to find solutions. So to the extent that we can, if you're interested, that scientists work to bridge those gaps and communicate science that's relevant to those who need to make these decisions about what their future land use will be, what their investments will be, where people will live, where they'll work, how they'll move, what their infrastructure looks like. I mean, it's just astonishing to me. Most of our infrastructure is built from the 1950s and 60s, based on rainfall patterns that were probably from the 40s. All of that needs updating. We need to figure out how to make avoid having so many outages. You can just pick any area, and it needs scientific acumen to improve the choices that are being made.
Well, we hear what you're saying. There's a lot to do. Thank you so much for talking about that. And of course, the data availability has so many equity implications too, because rich communities can afford the consultants, but we need to get data more available to all communities, and to let them know how to act. So we appreciate that. Well, we've had some questions coming in, so I'd like at this point to turn it open to the audience and accept some questions.
Yes. So if you do have a public question for Alice, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. We currently have two, one from Alf Brandt and one from Deirdre Desjardins, and we will go in the order that I called your name. Feel free to briefly introduce yourself to Alice if you want to. Thank you. Alf, you have the ability to unmute your microphone.
Hi, this is Alf Brandt. I'm counselor to the Speaker of the Assembly, and I've been doing water and Delta water in particular for about 30 years. And so my question for you moves from the science to the policymakers. And the question about, just as they asked about how the science can do it, we get requests for infrastructure, and we're looking at trillions of dollars for redoing water infrastructure that got built in California after World War II, basically. And so, it's coming to the end of its useful life, or it's already there. How do we prioritize? Because everybody's asking for money. We're in the middle of a budget process. Everybody asks for money for, but this infrastructure will fix this problem. And this is why this is the most important. And so can you tell me, how is it you would advise policymakers to engage in that prioritizing? How are the standards, and including dealing with equity? Because a lot of the infrastructure, because of the Corps of Engineers cost benefit analysis, the flood infrastructure in the Tulare Basin, for instance, where the lake is coming back, that infrastructure has been prioritized based on who has the most economic value. And so the little communities that don't have the economic value don't have the infrastructure. How do we balance all these things and take in the science and maybe direct scientists to answer questions? Or what do we do? How do we frame that to get to a priority system for making us resilient, our infrastructure resilient to climate change?
Well, it is a very difficult problem, because also there are a lot of politics involved with this. But at a minimum, you need to pull together the projects that are in play. And then you need to establish your metrics. And it could be the number of people served, the longevity of the project. It could be a whole host of metrics that would need to be worked through on a policy level and probably socialized with communities to make sure that you're getting to the concerns that should be present in any decision. And, it's a little like any big decision in our own lives. If you own your own home, are you going to spend it on the roof? Are you going to spend it on a new HVAC system, or whatever you're going to do when you have limited money? But what's going to serve your interest best? And the most important thing is to, in my opinion, is to figure out a framework for doing this. And this is where a state like California, that has been so forward-leaning and so progressive in trying to find solutions to climate change, could serve as a model in figuring out. And then you have the overlay of the federal money, because the metrics that the federal government uses, even between agencies, as you pointed out, may not match up. But to start that work of, okay, what are the projects we want to are in this pot, and then what are the metrics we're going to measure those against, and then what is our list, and then you publicize the list. Now, in an agency like FEMA, they kind of do this already, because they get these big pots of money every year. For example, the BRIC program, building resilience in something. It was actually Trump, happened under Trump, and they get 6% of all the disaster money spent by FEMA comes back into this pot, and it can get very big, which it did under COVID. And then FEMA divides it up. Now, the first year FEMA did it, they had richer communities apply, and the communities that had the consultants or the ability to come in, and turned out they gave a lot to the coasts, as I recall, not so much to inland states, and there was a lot of questions about equity. So now FEMA's been taken that experience, and they're improving the metrics that they use to prioritize which programs they're going to serve. But I think in any of the program, we're going to have to look at how many people are served, because that should be, or whatever the interests are, we don't want to be building the bridge to nowhere just because it's a resilient bridge. So it's going to have to be thinking through those things. Not an easy task, but it's one that calls for leadership, and the first iterations, I think, will shape what occurs in many places going forward, because this is a problem that will have to be solved if we want to build successfully in a resilient way.
Thank you. Our next question is from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone.
I don't know if I hope this panel will look into the issues with the ArcStorm 1.0 modeling, which was structured to be similar to the 1862 flood event. So you're probably not aware, but following the ArcStorm 1 scenario, which was done by USGS, Mike Dettinger was the lead. There was kind of a systematic denial that the levee system, the Sacramento Valley levees, couldn't handle an 1862 size flood, or that they couldn't handle the ArcStorm 1 scenario. And this has carried forward into some of the NGOs that I work with. It was a bit embarrassing when one of them published something recently during the storm saying, oh, this is all gloom and doom, and the Sacramento Valley levees can handle a repeat of the 1862 flood because it's about the same size as the 1997 flood. So I hope that you'll investigate. I think there's some cognitive biases that probably are driven by the politics of floodplain management in the Sac Valley, and there was $1 billion to upgrade the levees so they could build in the Thomas. But it's been a real barrier, and I have been advocating for modeling of use of modeling of flood flows that are higher than the existing flood system capacity, and even getting that for the San Joaquin River, where we know that the system capacity is going to be exceeded, has been very difficult. A lot of people just want to make investments based on earmarks rather than prioritizing based on modeling. So I would like to ask, if you have some experience with that kind of history, or how you can handle it when a group of large and powerful stakeholders is adverse to even considering the modeling.
So I do want to note that we are at the end of our time, but Alice, if you just wanted to provide a quick response to Deirdre's question about how we overcome cognitive biases or biases that might be politically motivated, I think that would be helpful.
Well, absolutely. This is going to be it is a fraud area because it's going to involve change, and people get nervous about change. What will it mean for me? And some people will perceive that they're losing as a result of choices being made. The political arena, the special interests, the skepticism about climate scientists all make this a extremely hard area to navigate. My response would be, we need to continue to navigate it. We know that people are at risk. We know that great harm could occur. We rest on the science. For you all, of all people, you are scientists and will rest and be guided by the science and continue to move forward. You know, I'll just leave you with this. When I was in the White House, I had my aha moment. I really saw that climate change would affect everything and that we needed to desperately change our approach. And I remember that one day somebody stopped by my office and said, "Oh, Alice, you're getting a reputation." And I said, "Oh, for what?" And they said, "For caring too much about climate change." And I said, well, that really mostly tells me that that person hasn't been exposed to what the risks are involved with climate change. So we have cognitive biases. We have a lot of politicization, but at the end of the day, what can guide us is the science and the knowledge that there are lives to be saved, property to be preserved if we make better choices. And so we're going to have to continue to discuss and find ways to move forward, even in the face of barriers and obstacles. That's all I can say, because that's what I chose to do, even though I was getting a reputation. That's okay. Let them come at it, because I knew that the science told me that we should really be acting now to save us all. So that's my message as you get discouraged by the opposition you may encounter, but it doesn't mean we should stop. It means we got to just find another way.
That's really wonderful, Alice. Thank you. I think you've given us a lot to think about, a great vision to keep persisting, and we'll really take your remarks to heart as we move through this effort. So we really want to thank you for the time spent with us. And at this point, the Delta ISB will take a 15-minute break, and we just thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are up and running. I'm sorry, your microphone's not on?
Welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone enjoyed that conversation. And now we move on to some of our more traditional meeting elements. Item agenda 3 is the chair's report and business matters. So here's a couple updates for you. Tomorrow, I'm going to attend the council's in-person meeting and present an update on our recent activities, the reviews that we've done, and also present our work plan for the coming year. So our new initiatives. And as part of that, I'm very interested to join in a tribal listening session that was already prearranged with the council. So other things that are happening is the Department of Water Resources the presentation on the Delta ISB's water supply reliability estimation was scheduled for April 10th, but has been postponed to later this year. So if you were planning to go to that, stay tuned for more information on when that presentation will occur. Something else that's been happening last month at the council meeting, Laura Larson presented, sorry, not at the council meeting, at the State Water Resources Control Board, Laura Larson presented an update on some of the ISB activities, including findings and recommendations of the scientific basis for implementing voluntary agreements. That was at their April public meeting, and a video recording as part of your meeting package. And so at this point, I'd just like to break from me, turn it over to Laurel, and let her explain some of the reactions that the board had.
Thanks, Lisa. And just to provide some context, as part of my duties, I do a quarterly report out of science program and council activities to the State Water Resources Control Board meeting. And at this April 4th meeting, I presented on ISB activities that included the comments on the draft scientific basis report for the voluntary agreements. I also provided report outs on the Delta conveyance draft EIR letter that you submitted, as well as a brief report on the 3 prospectuses that are underway. And that was also part of a report on other activities such as the upcoming Adaptive Management Forum, which is next week, the release of the Delta Science Tracker and Harmful Algal Blooms Workshop report, and the Integrated Modeling Framework Workshop. There were many comments on that suite of reports from the State Water Resources Control Board members. But the one that's relevant to the ISB was a comment by Joaquin Delta, the board chair, who underscored the critical importance of science in the update of the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. He acknowledged that they are moving fast by necessity on that update, but stated that he really values having this opportunity to get feedback from the Independent Science Board. And he commended your role in providing feedback, in particular on best available science and helping to define what is best available science with respect to the voluntary agreements. So that was really the main comment, but I would encourage you to listen to the video recording if you're interested. The general sentiment from the board members is that they were very appreciative of the letter and will be taking your feedback, and the staff will be taking your feedback seriously in the next steps.
Thank you, Laurel. Appreciate getting that feedback. So just to remind you, at our March in-person meeting, the Delta, that I wasn't able to attend, but everybody else did, the Delta ISB approved the draft prospectuses for the food webs and the subsidence reviews for public comment. The leads revised those draft prospectuses to address comments from our last meeting, and those were released yesterday. So public comments are due May 31st, and we encourage anyone listening to take a look at those and give us feedback on how they can be most useful. Next up, I want to announce some staffing changes, if you haven't heard. Karen Kafitz, who has really helped support the ISB as a supervisor of the staff that supports the ISB, she has left the council and is now with Cal Recycle, and she's was very happy to have the opportunity to use her knowledge of incentives for recycling to advance that program, and so is happy to have that new position. She joined the Delta ISB staff support team in 2019 after being with the council since 2015. And she really was instrumental in making sure we had the staff and logistical and financial support that we need to carry out our legislative mandate, and we are going to miss her. You know, when she wasn't helping the ISB, she had many other facets of her job. She and her team led many projects in the Delta Science program that help address some of our recommendations. And she really was a great partner in that, including the Adaptive Management Forum and the development of the Delta Conservation Adaptive Management Action Strategy. That's a mouthful. But basically, you know, we have a focus on adaptive management and reviewing those processes. And she was there to take up some of that advice and apply it in a very constructive way. Are there any other comments from the board about Karen? Tanya.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I had the pleasure of interacting with Karen, not only through ISB meetings, but also through several planning meetings that Karen ran for the Salinity Management Workshop and the Adaptive Management Forum, as well as the committee meetings we had for hiring Kyra, our new Sea Grant Fellow. And Karen just really has a gift for understanding and communicating the complexity of the Delta as a social, ecological, and political system. I think she really knows the ins and outs of how the Delta functions and what the management challenges are. And, you know, she'll be definitely missed. And in particular, I have to say that Karen was really a genius at running meetings and organizing teams. Despite juggling a lot of balls with her position, she just never seemed frazzled, and she had some of the best warm-ups and introductions at meetings that I've ever seen. She really made everyone feel welcome and their voices appreciated. So I'm sad to see her leaving the Delta Science program, but I know she's going to do great things for the state of California at CalRecycle. So congratulations to Karen. I hope you're chiming in or listening somewhere. Yes.
I hope so too. Any other comments? Okay, not seeing any. I want to report that since the last public meeting, we had some public correspondence, which is part of your meeting package. We got an announcement from California Water Research on a talk that was on some research on the Atlantic multi-decadal variability. And so we appreciated getting that heads up. And at this point, I'm done with the business matters. And are there any public comments?
Yes, there is one from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
As you know, I sent you guys a draft. I did a very extensive review of recent literature on climate dynamics. And I wanted to report that Michael Mann just on Twitter just said, you know, it's time to address the La Nina-like trends in the Pacific. And I went back and was stunned to find that some of what I put together in my review were similar to comments he'd made in something in a opinion article on the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences about current challenges. So I think it's really important because it's a radically different scenario, and that we could see a continuation of the kind of 21st century mega drought that we've seen. And I did mention this, you can see it on the State Water Board, the lead scientist State Water Board. I did mention that at the end, and then I thought it was important. And the lead scientist mentioned conversations with Scripps Institute about downscaling. And I like, in the interest of best available science, for her to provide the articles that that's based on, because my understanding is that these issues won't be addressed by downscaling. They're fundamental to the physics of the climate models. And there are some important processes that will be resolved better with dynamic downscaling and the weather research and forecasting model. But I think it's incredibly important as we go forward, and the council and that both the Delta Science Program and the Delta Independent Science Board try to deal with issues of climate change, that
we use the best available science. And I want to say also that I did have a discussion with Andrew Schwartz, and he pointed out that he's not a climate dynamics expert, and it's not an expertise that we have within state agencies. So it's an incredibly important area because there's some major developments where we're realizing the models are wrong. And the Atlantic multi-decadal variability is one. The researchers said that there's also going to be some new developments coming out showing that the Pacific decadal variability may be mostly forced in recent decades. So that's a radical change in our understanding of the dynamics in both the Atlantic and the North Pacific. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Deirdre. And, you know, one of my takeaways from your comments is that just because it has started raining doesn't mean we should stop thinking about the mega droughts. So, but certainly we appreciate the focus on the best science and continue to carry that forward. So now I'll just move on to the next agenda item, item 4. A discussion of the prospectus of decision-making under deep uncertainty review. And I'm not going to present on that again because we have presented on it many times. But I will tell you that you received the prospectus in your meeting packet, and the Delta ISB provided a lot of feedback at the March in-person meeting. And since that meeting, we have revised the prospectus to improve the narrative of the motivation for the review, you know, why we think this is helpful and necessary. And hopefully some of that came across in the prior seminar. We clarified that we are not developing scenarios, the ISB, but reviewing the science and how scenarios are being developed or selected. And we clarified that a workshop will not be an input to the review. Had some version issues there. So what we're looking for today is your feedback on that new prospectus. Do you think it's ready to go out for public comment, particularly if after we address any comments raised today? So at this point, I really just open it up for discussion, and also I'll invite any other members of the team, Tanya Obey, if you have anything you want to add. Oh, and Tom has a hand up already. So
Yeah, I got my comments ready. This was actually a question I was going to ask Alice Hill. She talked about the cognitive problems and the communication problems, and it occurred to me the subject matter here, what we're calling these things, there's a whole world of terminology, and this doesn't come out in the prospectus very well. And I'll just go through it because it's really kind of impressive. Low probability, high impact events. One I just learned recently was right and left of boom. Deep uncertainty, which we're using, extreme events. And then there's seldom a distinction between climate change and global change. She was talking mostly in terms of climate change, but a big part of the climate change problem is global change. And then finally, the animals that you asked about, the rhinos, the swans, the elephant. Anyway, it seems to me you need to put deep uncertainty in some semantic context, because I think while a lot of people aren't going to have been looking at this in breadth, and I know just coming out of my own narrow specialty in earthquakes, we have our own terminology that we use. And when you talk to another earthquake person, they know what you're talking about. But deep uncertainty, I don't think rings universally yet. So that a context paragraph or statement, I think, would be helpful. And then the second comment is in the I forget what the section's called. There's a reference to what other studies the board has done on the subject. In the water supply reliability, we do talk about extreme events and deep uncertainty. So we were addressing it in that context. We didn't get that far into it, but Jay and I have been talking about emphasizing it more at the presentation, because it's an important part of the tails of the curves. So, yeah, inserting a excuse me, inserting a reference to the water supply reliability in that section would be good.
Yeah.
That's my comments.
Yeah, that's certainly appropriate, Tom. And I think I want to ask you some follow-up questions about the semantic issue, but I think I'll let Obey go first. So.
Let me unmute myself first. Thank you, Lisa. Actually, a couple of, well, a feedback to Tom on the deep uncertainty terminology. I think at the bottom of page 1, the paragraph has some description of what we mean by deep uncertainty. I was going to ask Tom if that's not addressing it, if there's anything we need to add. But my second comment is on what Elise, in her talk, talked about these white swans and black swans. I wanted some clarification. In reality, it's both that we are addressing. We have a great example is like the nuisance flooding in Florida as white swans, if I understand her terminology correctly. And the black swans are this rare hurricane, stronger hurricanes or kind of event that happened in Fort Lauderdale on April 12th, which is off the chart. So I was wondering if, we needed to have that clarification, but probably not relevant to the prospectus here. But anyway, that's all I had.
Yeah, Tom, you want to respond to Obey, and then I'm going to jump in here.
Yeah, I think that sentence is a little too short and sweet to be a good reference, because you probably don't want to go through the whole list that I have, but maybe a reference to something like the low probability, high impact events, which I think are the same thing here.
Okay.
I don't know whether extreme events, maybe that would be another. Anyway, just make it clear that the words you're using here are actually other disciplines might use a different terminology.
Okay.
I think in the original version, we actually had some more of those terms, but took them out thinking that it was a lot of jargon. So I guess, there's no perfect solution here.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can crosswalk some of those. And we do probably want to make sure that we've been clear that we are essentially broadening the deep uncertainty envelope to include extreme events for which we do have probabilities, flood or not. But we wanted to include those because they tend to get ignored in how we typically analyze systems. So they're out there in the tails, but they don't get sampled very often in a Monte Carlo analysis or something like that. So they effectively are ignored. So we should make sure, we should reread with that idea of making sure it's very clear. But I guess, Tom, I question whether it is valuable to introduce a lot of jargon that just to crosswalk fields. I mean, I think this document is meant to be a fairly publicly accessible document. So yeah, I'm happy to add low probability, high consequence events, which was definitely in one version of this, and I'm surprised if it's not in this one. Is that going to satisfy?
Yeah, that would be adequate. I don't think you have to go through that whole list that I've rattled off, but I think my question to Alice was going to be, are we sort of shooting ourselves in the foot by having these different words for sort of the same thing? And we're not, I know when I talk to lay people, which word I choose can lead to a blank stare or an interest in what I'm talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Go ahead, Obey.
Yeah, can I chime in on what you just said? I think it's an important point. The idea that we broaden the deep uncertainty concept include extremes with maybe even finite probabilities or probabilities that could be estimated. I wonder if we need to make that clear in the document somewhere, because many people, when they look at deep uncertainty, may not include those other or broadening that we had done here. So I was curious if we had a sentence to say that in here. Just
I
the
think we
surface
did,
area.
but let's look again and make sure that's clear.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. And I would recommend you stay away from the animals.
Yeah, I had never heard of the gray rhino, I'll admit. Okay, great. Diane. And Diane, this is also an opportunity for you to say whether you have any declarations.
Oh, I have no new declarations. It's the end of the semester, so that's my other declaration. So when I was listening to the seminar, which I thought was fascinating, I was really struck by this integration with economic uncertainty and, the bridges to the barrier islands and how that's considered differently, and that there's deep uncertainty in terms of economic aspects of all of this. And I was planning, I thought, I hadn't been thinking of that when I read the draft a couple days ago, but it was more of a focus in Alice Hill's presentation. And maybe, obviously this is way outside what I know, but maybe a topic that will come up as this, if this were to proceed as a workshop, you see what I'm saying? And whether it needs to be in the prospectus or what feedback may come from the perspective, but this idea, is it a good investment? Yeah. And I was thinking about the barrier islands, and maybe it's not a good investment because all those people, they might be going underwater anyway. Well, how are they going to get off the island? That's a different way of looking at it. So I'm just putting that out there. I don't have a suggestion for path forward. And I'm going to have to leave in 5 minutes.
Okay, well then a quick response is we absolutely agree with that sentiment that there are economic and social considerations that go into these scenarios and deep uncertainty. So that it wasn't intentional to leave that off. It's just the examples take a long time to explain, and we didn't want the perspectives to keep growing and growing. So, yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that, but appreciate the comments that that's not well represented. Yeah, we'll try to change that. Obey, did you want to respond to that? I feel like
yeah, I do. This bridge to a coastal or barrier island has come up in many places. In reality, it has come up in Miami Beach as well. This is where the dynamic adaptive pathway strategies come into the picture. People don't want to leave right away because that bridge the island would be underwater someday. So I think it has to be a phasing in of the adaptation solution. So it's not a black and white situation in my mind. It's a comment on that.
Yeah, and I think it also just generally echoes what Alice was saying in terms of, it's a multi-objective problem, and you're going to look at different performance metrics for different solutions, whether they're one big investment or many small investments that are part of this phased approach. So yeah, I think it's a really good point. So Inga, what was your comment?
Thank you. Well, I'm not in the modeling world, but just reading the prospectus as it is now, I thought it was much more clear what you actually will be doing. And in my mind, it's quite understandable now. And so just wanted to say something positive. Thank you.
And we appreciate it. Tanya.
Oh, I just wanted a quick follow up to Diane's comment. I think we have, at least in the workshop planning, really thought carefully about how we can make sure we incorporate some of these questions around economic and social uncertainties into laying out what are some of the tools and the processes that are available under the kind of DMDU umbrella for dealing with those types of uncertainties. So we may not have really captured that in a lot of detail in the prospectus, but hopefully as our seminar series unfolds, we'll have a little more of that.
Right. So Tanya, you actually said workshop, but she meant the seminar series.
Yeah,
So
sorry. Yeah.
just because that was already a point of contention.
Yeah.
Feel
That
the
works.
need to clarify.
Seminar. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, exactly. We are certainly thinking about that and looking across different drivers that include social drivers. So yeah, we don't want to announce more details of the seminar series because we're still working out speakers and topics, and we haven't invited everybody yet. So we'll keep working on that. Virginia.
So something that occurred to me that I didn't bring up earlier, excuse me, but as Alice Hill was talking, is time. And that is, you know, she was talking a lot about decision-making in the short term. And a lot of the climate change scenarios, you know, are longer term. Maybe they're 2030, which is fairly short term. And I think of this because, Obey, there was a presentation on NPR recently about people buying land in Miami and buying houses and so forth. And all the buyers they talked to said, well, you know, I'm thinking of my time. I wouldn't get my children to buy into this, but you know, the time frame of decisions is an important part of this, related to the time frame of when these uncertain events are going to happen. And so I don't know exactly how, but I think time needs to be a part of the discussions as they unfold, because it plays into how people make decisions.
A really good point. And Obey's comments about dynamic adaptive planning would bring that in a very concrete way, because you look at, say, if there's decision triggers where, you know, if you're planning for a 50-year horizon and you get some information, you actually switch to a new adaptive strategy. So those are the decision triggers. So sometimes it's very concrete, but I think you're also just raising a more general point, which is of the people we hope to influence, what are their time horizons, and are they the appropriate ones for the type of investments? And I will say, in other work I've done with DMDU, something that comes up a lot is that it can be perhaps too much for, not necessary for decisions that have, where you can change your strategy very quickly. So, but it's more important when it's a strategy you're baking in over a many year period. So in some sense, there is already a time element, but we can certainly bring that out more, I think. And I think Obey wants to get in here. Go ahead, Obey.
Yeah, I just have it might not be related to that, but I do have another question that came up during the discussion or during the presentations. I'm not an expert on cognitive biases, but now I understand what it means. I think there are, you know, various versions of those biases, but I was wondering, when we have the interviews, if you need to think about this, how does politics get in the way of scenario planning and assessment? Is that something we need to think about in our interviews and work? Although I'm not sure. It seems like it's an important aspect, you know, besides cognitive biases. And from my experience, sometimes the scenarios that you might want to look at for legitimate reasons might not be encouraged by the decision makers due to political reasons. I don't know if that's relevant to, it seems to me that's relevant to our discussion.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Tanya, did you have a comment on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, the politics question, Obey, does relate to some of the cognitive biases as well. And, you know, a lot of the research on polarization right now and political dynamics talks about in-group, out-group biases, and how that's really foundational to, you know, the way that we view what's appropriate and what's relevant information. So I think there's ways of even, folding that into some of the cognitive bias discussion if space for that.
That sounds good.
I've also been thinking about that for a seminar we might have on scenario development techniques to overcome cognitive biases, but also socialize it in a way that makes it more comfortable for folks. I guess it's two sides of the coin, really. Yeah, we could elaborate on a lot of things in here, but that's certainly in our head, and I'm glad we're having this discussion. So. Are there any other comments? Perhaps we will get through this agenda item under time. So let's see, at this point, if there are no other comments, do we have a motion to approve the content after making these adjustments that we've discussed today?
I move that we accept the prospectus after incorporating the changes that were discussed today.
I second.
I second it, yeah.
Okay, great. Inga, Anna moves, Inga seconds. Sorry, I think there was another voice in there. Let's go with Inga. All right, so now we will open it up to public comments if there are any.
Yeah, yes, we have one from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone.
Yeah, there's actually a history of this that I think you might not be aware of. So there was the Department of Water Resources convened a climate change technical advisory group from 2012 to 2015. And they sorted through the set of 31 CMIP 5 climate models and selected 10 for use in DWR's modeling. But in addition, they considered overarching questions. And one of the things that came out in their recommendations was developing extreme scenarios. And it was for both drought and flooding. And the state climatologist, Michael Anderson, was involved, Dan Kyan was involved. And I think it would be a really good idea to try to look back at why that recommendation in the 2015 report wasn't followed through. Because this isn't the first time it's happened, and I did have a meeting with folks at the California Office of Emergency Services where I talked about there's absolute chaos in the Tulare Lake Basin because they have avoided figuring out where they would route flood flows when they had flooding similar to historic flooding in the basin. And I said, you know, we really need to have these forums where people look at and decide the difficult questions in advance. You know, so we're not making these difficult decisions about where to route flood flows under emergency conditions. And they were all for it. But even with, I was surprised, they've just done a Northern California flooding emergency response, and it doesn't include the scenario of flood flows that exceed the capacity of the Sac Valley flood system. And it's just, I think if you could look both at those, and I think it might be good to invite people from emergency services and also the flood board, because you know, like the flood board, I looked for their floodplain maps and they're relying on 1996 FEMA maps. And so there's all kinds of places where things are stuck. And you have more authority than I do as an outside troublemaker to gently ask questions and kind of tease out, because I don't think anybody intends to look the other way and have catastrophic consequences as happened in the Oroville spillway incident, but that's where we're heading. And I am concerned that given the kind of extreme precipitation event that we saw in Miami, which was 4 times the amount of rainfall in 24 hours that they saw in Germany in 2021, that we can see an extreme precipitation event sooner rather than later. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Deirdre. Yeah, we are, you know, just to let you know, we are trying to survey some of this information, and we appreciate your input on that. I will say that I have become aware that quite a bit is going on both at the state level and within the Delta to look at some of these issues. And we'll hear from Andrew Schwartz next in June on some of that work. But I think, obviously we want to have this conversation that you're describing. And so hopefully we can figure out who the right people are to invite and have that conversation with. So appreciate that input.
Let me just say, so I did talk with Andrew a little bit about this after the extreme flooding in Miami, and he's not doing flooding. It's Roman mainly who's doing flooding. And Roman, I had asked him questions about what DWR was doing to handle extreme flooding, and he said, we're going to be coming out with modeling of groundwater replenishment. It's called FLEDMAR in 2022, and then that release has been delayed. And one could see it's being, the whole groundwater replenishment strategy is being a disaster in the Tulare Lake Basin right now.
Okay, well, these are important issues to look at, and we will be looking at what we can within the scope. So thank you. Okay, so now back to the DMDU prospectus. Do we have any other public comments?
There are no additional public comments.
Okay, so at this point, I'll conduct a roll call vote to see who, if we have approval to move the prospectus to the public version. Virginia.
I approve.
Tanya.
I approve.
Tom.
Aye.
Anna.
Aye.
Diane still here?
No.
No, Diane has to leave. Bob.
Yes, I approve.
Obey.
I approve.
Inga.
Yes, I approve.
And I also approve. Okay, so with that, we will make the changes discussed today and get a public version out soon. All right, at this point, we're to agenda item 5. The Delta ISB is going to go into a closed session to discuss the Delta lead scientist reappointment. And just as some background, the Delta Reform Act stipulates that the Delta Stewardship Council consult with the Delta ISB in appointing the Delta lead scientist. So this is one of our key activities. Dr. Laura Larson is about to complete her 3-year term as Delta lead scientist. And at our March in-person public meeting, the council requested that the Delta ISB start the recruitment process for the next Delta lead scientist. Dr. Larson's term will end in August 2023, and she is able to stay on as Delta lead scientist for a second term, but just an abbreviated second term until June 2024. So this closed session is going to discuss that possible reappointment of Dr. Larson as the Delta lead scientist through June 2024. And just to dot the i's, this closed session is authorized under Government Code section 11126 subdivision A1. So with this, the board will now adjourn to closed session, and we will return in about 20 minutes. Okay, thank you all. Can't see all the participants.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are back rolling again.
Welcome back to the April Delta Independent Science Board meeting. We've just completed our closed session and we now reconvene with 8 ISB members. Steve Brandt and Diane McKnight had planned absences at this point, so they were also absent from the closed session. All right, so what do I'll just report out on our closed session. So the Delta ISB will recommend to the council to reappoint Dr. Larson through the end of June of 2024. And we had a roll call vote, and the 8 members that voted all voted in favor. So that means that I will prepare a letter to the council recommending that reappointment of the Delta lead scientist, and that will be on the agenda of the May council meeting. So with that, we'll move on to agenda item number 7, preparing for upcoming Delta ISB meetings. So the May 17th meeting is going to be a webinar. And so far, the main agenda item is to discuss public comments on the prospectuses, probably just for the 2 that we have.
We're on the home stretch.
That's right, we are on the home stretch. And then our June 14th meeting, June 14th through the 16th, will be an in-person meeting. And we'll have another decision-making under deep uncertainty seminar with Robert Lempert from RAND. And
it could be
sorry,
Hollywood Squares.
All right, V, can you be on mute?
Okay. Pardon me.
Okay, so yeah, that DMDU seminar will be Robert Lemper of RAND Corporation, who has been doing this work and a real thought leader in this field, and Andrew Schwartz, who's really taking those recommendations and applying them within DWR, to some extent. So we're going to find out more. So that will be a longer seminar, I believe, and you'll get details soon. And then also there will be a field trip. We're going to take a boat tour to help us understand the hydrology and the hydraulics of the Delta, and really get a view of the Central Delta and the levees from a boat. That's going to help us understand how water quality works. We may be able to visit the Delta Cross Channel by boat, and then also possibly Frank's Tract, where there's a drop barrier. So Edmund, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think you covered it.
So that really is our plan for the next 2 meetings. Are there any public comments?
There are none.
All right, well, with that, are there any public comments for matters that are not on the agenda?
We should also have a follow-up item.
I know, that's not here. Yeah, should we do that before or after this?
We can do that first, but there are none.
Okay, no public comments. Okay, and now I will turn it over to Edmund to give us our action items.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so at today's meeting, OBE had a declaration and will update our Delta ISB disclosure page, indicating that OBE has an IPA with the Army Corps of Engineers to look into sea level rise in some European countries. So for today's meeting, the Delta ISB approved the draft prospectus for decision-making under deep uncertainty after the comments from the meeting are addressed. Some of the comments that the review leads will address include better defining deep uncertainty to indicate that it goes beyond the common definition of deep uncertainty, and doing some potential crosswalking of other common terms in terms of how people refer to deep uncertainty, like low probability, high consequence events. In terms of the section in the perspectives, in terms of other reviews, just to double check that there is a reference to the water supply reliability estimation review that the Delta ISB did, which had some sections on extreme events. There was also some comments about the need to consider economic and social considerations and scenarios that wasn't mentioned in the prospectus. That was intentional, just because the review leads cannot provide every single example, but it'll be covered in the seminar down the line. But the review leads will look into that to make sure if there's any room to improve on that. So,
and then I'll just add that we also noted that we want to make sure we're clear about that the time is important, and maybe we'll reemphasize that a bit under the dynamic adaptive.
Yes, got that as well. All right, any other things that I missed that you guys agreed upon for the draft prospectus for DMDU? Yep, for the record, the motion was made by Anna, seconded by Inga, and approved by all ISB members with the exception of Steve and Diane. For the report out the open session for the Delta lead scientist recruitment, Dr. Wanger reported out that the ISB will be recommending to the council to reappoint Dr. Larson to a partial second term through June 2024. After the meeting today, she will prepare a recommendation letter to present to the council for their May public meeting. That's all I have for follow-up items, unless there's anything anyone would like to add.
All right, hearing none, I think we can go ahead and call this meeting to a close. Thank you for your engagement today.
Yeah, there are no public comments.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I think, yes, we are really done. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.